Hey there, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Alchemi-Culture podcast. I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius. Today, we have with you a really special guest, Dan Olsen, who has been working basically for many, many years with primitive hunting, primitive weaponry, education. You may have heard his name already by his company, 4D Blades. Maybe you're a student of his actually, and you have studied with him at Tradition School or at the Starry Garden Montessori School, Traditions Education, pardon me. And perhaps you know him from various primitive skills gatherings. That's in fact where I met him. Recently, Nori and I, back in June of this year, went to Fire to Fire, and I heard Dan talk at the opening circle and just thought, you know what, his classes, all of them, every single one, and spent the entire time working with Dan. So Dan, welcome to Alchemi-Culture. Thank you so much for coming on and being able to talk with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, man, I'm happy that you're here. So, I was just kind of letting people know, you're a blacksmith, especially a bladesmith in particular. You also make bows, you make arrows, you make atlatls, you make, rabbit sticks. You make all sorts of different types of things, snares and so on and so forth. Tell us, how did you get into that kind of work?
Well, it's kind of interesting. So when I was a little guy, I think probably about 6 years old, my grandmother had grown up in the mountains of southern Idaho. She was a daughter of a sheep herder. And so she spent most of her time, it was during the Depression, so she spent most of her time roaming and foraging in the hills there. So when I was a little guy, she'd take us up in the mountains and she'd teach us about the different plants and things. And I have one memory in particular where she took us on a hike and she had a jar of mayo and a bag of bread. And she took us on this hike, kind of up a creek bed. And she went down into the stream and pulled out big handfuls of this kind of leafy green plant and slapped some mayo on the bread and put this leafy green plant on it and handed it to me. And when you're 6, your grandma hands you a sandwich, you eat it, right?
It's
just like, yeah, of course, this is normal, right? So I ate it and it had this beautiful kind of nutty, spicy flavor. And I thought, oh, okay, this is super normal. So I grew up thinking that those kind of skills were like part of becoming an adult. If you don't know how to identify the plants in the wild, then you can't be a grown-up, right? And so that stuck with me. That same idea stuck with me. And as I got older, I realized that not all grown-ups knew this, but I started to really seek out those people who did know those sorts of things. From a really early age, I would much rather be outside than inside. And I was always fascinated by things from the past. I lived a lot of different places growing up. And so the past gave me almost an anchor in my life because I'd lived in Alaska and Georgia and Nevada and Utah, and my family just traveled a lot. And so I was always fascinated by things from history, and not just museum type stuff that you look at and learn about, but I wanted to experience it.
Yeah.
So little by little, I just started experimenting with things or asking people to teach me. And over time, I was able to begin developing some skills. But that curiosity has always been with me. So that's kind of where I got my real initial start into this kind of world of ancestral skills.
Man, that's really cool actually to hear. And, I remember you telling me about that when we were at Fire to Fire. It seems like the love of herbs and plants and, I guess what we could call in the academic world ethnobotany just in general has been something that's really stuck with you. I'm sorry if I'm blowing the lid on it, but if I remember right, you're actually writing a book about these things. Isn't that right?
I am. It's definitely not a secret. I do tell people about it, and I'm hard at work. One of the challenges of writing a book is it just takes a long time. I want it to be a field guide so people can go out and accurately identify plants and understand how to use them. So and putting the time and the effort into making that happen. I did have a rough situation happen this last year. One of the computers that I had majority of the photos on for this book ended up crashing, and it was unretrievable. So at first I was kind of, it makes you sick to your stomach when that happens, but it just gave me an excuse to spend more time in the mountains. So, and I don't have a deadline for this book, which is dangerous because there's always one more thing you want to add.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's going to go from a field guide to, who knows, a encyclopedia. But it's just so much fun. And when I think about, as you identified, the ethnobotany, I am interested in the food and medicinal value of plants, but also the functional tool value. How do we use different plants and the characteristics of them to make tools? And through that, we have a really strong connection with our environment. And actually, when I teach kids about plants, I refer to the plants as my friends, because a good friend, we get to know each other. You know their names, you know things they like and they don't like. For example, I'll tell them about poison ivy. Poison ivy in particular is a plant that just really doesn't like to be touched. Some of our human friends don't especially like to be touched, right? And they'll ask us not to touch them. Well, poison ivy has to do it through a different way because it doesn't speak English. And hopefully we understand what it speaks. But when we're working with our friends, I have some philosophies that I teach in relationship to plants that we talk about kind of as a friendship. So if we're good friends with somebody and we notice that they can help us out, we can ask them if they'll help us out. But if we notice that they're having a hard time and maybe they can't help us out, then we offer to help them out. And we do that same thing with plants. One of my favorite examples is if you have a snack and your friend asks to have some of your snack and you share that with them, that's part of being a good friend. But if they ask if they can have some of your snack and you say yes, and they take all of your snack, then you're kind of like, well, that wasn't very nice.
Yeah.
And so that's a fun thing that kids can really relate with. And I find one of my favorite things about helping kids understand and connect with nature is getting them to really be involved with it. So we're harvesting plants, they're eating some of them, even picky eaters. It's really funny.
Yeah.
Even kids who are picky eaters will eat those plants because they're just really curious about it. And through that process, we give them a connection with nature that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But that's something that we've had ancestrally. Our ancestors had that close connection with nature. It was part of who they were. And I want to help restore that, not just for kids, for everybody. But I think if we start with the kids, then they can help pass that on. That's how I got connected into this, was through somebody being willing to share that with me at a time that maybe it wasn't as popular as it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there were a couple of things that you were saying there that, I'm constantly relating back to the way that plants communicate. Like, for instance, when you go out on a hot summer day and you're walking through, especially, high desert like we have here in Utah and in Idaho and, Eastern Oregon and other places, you can smell the sage, you can smell the rabbit brush, you can smell the pinon pitch from the trees, you can smell all these things. And that's one of the first ways that these trees are communicating with all of their surroundings. They're constantly emitting volatile oils and essential oils through their living process of exhalation and perspiration and so on and so forth, transpiration. And so it ends up, you already are communicating with these plants. They already are communicating with you, whether you're really aware of it or not. And it's funny, it doesn't take a lot to learn what urushiol, which is the main communication platform of poison ivy, feels like or smells like. Even if you smell it burning, it's a pretty bad one.
Yep. Yeah, it communicates really clearly.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think it's cool to open, especially for kids. Most of the time I'm teaching adults, people who wish that they would have had teachers like you, programs like you in their youth, didn't have access to it. And then they try and pick up these skills in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, so on and so forth. But it's cool, even from my perspective, to be able to see when somebody does pick up on, oh yeah, I actually do know what this communication is. I've just never paid attention to it. It's like voices talking in the background that you just tried to tune out until you knew that they were saying something valuable. And so, yeah.
I had that experience just this last week. My sister got in touch with me. She'd found a little weedy plant that had kind of a sticky substance all over it and on the flowers and things. And it had a really strong smell that reminded her of kind of a mix between pine sap and cottonwood buds.
We're talking about gumweed?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she knew what it was communicating, but she didn't know its name. And so we were able to identify a lot of the active chemicals that were in it and uses that we might put it to based on the smell and the communication. So even though she didn't know its name, because we had those conversations, she began to understand what it was trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. Gumweed is actually one of my very favorite herbs. It grows everywhere, just all over the place where I'm at. I've got it out in the yard. I've got it, on all of my favorite hiking trails. And out here hiking, there are a lot of springs. And so I don't suggest anybody do this unless they have really good honed in skills and know their limits. But I'll oftentimes hike around without a water bottle and try and just find new springs and new spots of fresh water. And one of the things that's always carried me through is that gumweed, because a little bit of it inside of the mouth creates those salivary glands to just keep going, so you don't get that dry, parched mouth during that hiking process. And so, yeah, I love it. Well, and of course, it's got so many other medicinal properties too when you tincture it or put it into
it's phenomenal.
Oil infusions.
Oil infusions, I think, are my favorite. I really like to make salves with it.
Yeah.
But you know what I like to do, because it's down on the ground and that sort of thing, and you get so sticky whenever you're harvesting it. So I'll get a bunch of kids together and give them paper bags, and they don't mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting sticky, and so they'll fill up all the bags. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Then we of course take them and show them how to make things with them. And because it's got all of that the sap and stuff on it that is so active, we can get a result from it a lot faster than we do with some of the other infusions that we might do. And so it's fun for them to see kind of a quick result out of that.
Yeah. That's one of the more fun, and at least for our environment here in the Mountain West, one of the more widely available plants. Like the chance of over harvesting that is really, really rare.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if of course there's that risk, right?
Yeah,
so
with anything,
we don't want to be too flippant about it, but it's very plentiful.
Yeah, exactly. Its reproductive capacity is sometimes annoying. So
for sure.
Yeah. So, well, you've developed all of these skills over the years. How did you make the transition between, learning these traditions and then starting to turn it into a profession? What did that look like for you?
Well, as you can imagine, it was a long process. So learning started when I was really pretty young.
Yeah.
I I have a funny memory. I had been reading a magazine and I found Larry Dean Olsen's book, Wilderness Survival, in this magazine. And I thought, this is it. And of course, this was before the internet or Amazon. I couldn't just go get it.
Yeah.
So I started calling around, and I was living in Battle Mountain, Nevada, next to nothing, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Closest town is 60 miles away. And so I called everywhere I could in 2 states. And finally, I found a place in Salt Lake City that had a copy of this book. And so I was 17, I drove all the way to Utah to get a copy of this book. And it was like gold to me, because I couldn't find any other books like that. There was no other information out there about it. My scout leaders, I was really lucky. They were both into mountain man reenacting. And so they had developed a number of skills, fire building and those kinds of things, and were really, really open and willing to share that information. In fact, one of my scout masters, his name's David Layton, was the first one to start teaching me about how to make a bow. And so I asked him one day, I said, how did you learn how to make a bow? And he says, well, I went to rabbit stick. And I was like, what's a rabbit stick?
What's that? Yeah.
And so he told me about that. And then he told me about this gathering. I was like, are you kidding? There's other people like me out there. There's other people who are interested in this stuff. It's got to be the most amazing place in the world. And to be honest, when I was 17 and I went for the first time, it was the most amazing place in the world. And man, I idolize those guys still, by the way. I still idolize those guys. And so I saw that, and I thought, at that time, I thought, I don't know how I pull this off, but I'm going to do this, whether I do it professionally or not. This is something I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. So,
of course, you can't make a living, or couldn't at that time make a living doing that. After continuing to do as much as I could and learn as much as I could through high school, I moved to Australia for a little while. I was serving mission there, and had an opportunity to get to know a number of the Aboriginal folks that lived there and learn from them. And they were incredibly generous with their knowledge. And that's one thing about this community that I found, is the people who have these skills are always willing to share them.
Yeah.
And that's something that has made the difference for me. It makes me so willing to share. And by the way, the bladesmithing community, for the most part, is very much like that as well. And so through these experiences, I began to, I don't know if you ever feel really confident. What I mean by that is, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so over time, I began to be somewhat confident. I began to feel at home wherever I happened to be, and had that kind of confidence. I could be in the mountains of southern Utah. I spent a lot of time around Cedar City area, and then down, I did some guiding in the Grand Staircase area, and I always felt very much at home there. I spent a whole summer, I lived out of my car. Somebody could have called me homeless, but it was very much intentional. I lived out of my car and backpacked and did rock climbing, and I didn't really need a lot of money because I didn't have a lot of bills and things. But something interesting started happening. After a while, people began to notice that I understood and knew certain things, and they'd ask questions, and I'd tell them a little bit about it, and they'd say, well, hey, can you teach me that? And I'd be like, well, yeah, okay, let me show you something. And that's how that transition started happening. Was over time, people would ask, and I'd have an opportunity to share with them. My family, I met and married my wife, and she grew up as a sheep herder's daughter in the mountains of southern Utah. Her family owns several hundred sheep there. In fact, if you're ever in Cedar City during the livestock festival and you see the sheep being pushed down the middle of town, that's my wife's family, and I get to help with that every year. It's a lot of fun. That is well cool. So I got lucky in that department, sincerely, because not every woman is going to be excited about some guy. My wife isn't either, but not, more than once she's come home and said, Dan, why is there a coyote in the bathtub? And I'd be like, well, so-and-so had it and didn't have time to take care of it. And she's like, that still doesn't explain why it's in the bathtub. Exactly. Well, so she's a saint, for sure. But this was something that was also kind of part of her upbringing. And so it became very normal for me to be exploring this and spending the time doing that. And because of her support, I was able to begin offering little classes. Well, my family moved. I went through college and I was studying exercise physiology, and later became a human movement expert. The official title is Fellow of Applied Functional Science. Through that, I had work in the fitness industry. I actually was a certified triathlon coach. And I made an interesting connection with the world of paleo diet type things. Yeah. I was, of course, interested in the health benefits, but very much in the, does this fully fit our ancestral diet? Yeah. And of course, you can't make blanket statements about that.
Yeah.
Because
It
we have
varies.
lots of different ancestral pathways, right? But I found it really interesting and was able to explore that and learn more about that from a lens of sports nutrition. So I spent several years working in sports nutrition. Um, and of course, from the time I was a little child, the native plants was always very interesting to me. So my family moved to the Seattle area and we lived up in that area. And that's where I began offering classes to different people and actually getting paid for it. And that was over several years, about 7 years. And then finally, my family decided, for a number of reasons, that we were going to move back to Utah and that we wanted to start a school, mostly because we wanted an environment for my kids to learn where they were learning the kinds of things we wanted them to learn, essentially.
Yeah.
So while we were running that school, the opportunities to begin offering classes really, really increased. And that's where I started getting more involved in teaching at gatherings and that kind of thing. Actually, Brad Wade, who runs Fire to Fire,
Right.
He and I ran into each other at kind of a gathering through an organization called WISE, or the Wilderness Instruction Skills Exchange. And he said, "Hey, I hear you make bows." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Will you come teach at my gathering?" And I was like, "Oh my, wow, yeah, definitely." You know, because from the time I was 17, I had idolized those guys.
Yeah.
And sincerely, I felt a little bit out of my league, honestly. And I got there and I taught, and it went really, really well. And I thought, man, this is really cool. I want to keep doing this. And so this is the kind of thing that I wish I could have gotten into from the time I graduated high school. But the reality for most of us is it's a long, slow transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
So finally, I guess we're at a point now where we're getting this tradition school really going, and we're working with people of all different ages. We do teach adult classes as well. But now this is it. I do this. I make knives and I teach. I teach full time. And it's funny because both of my parents were teachers, and I had sworn I would never become a teacher because I knew how hard they work.
Yeah.
But now, because of where I'm at, I understand why they work so hard, why they cared so much, because I feel like I'm very much in the same boat.
Yeah. Well, we're almost at the top of our 30 minutes here. So we're going to take a break. But when we come back, I want to actually talk a little bit more about the way that you teach and the integrated way that you teach, because even though I learned amazing skills from you, I was fascinated with how you interact with all of your students. And, you know, I saw you with kids, I saw you with adults, I saw you with a wide range of age groups, and it was just so impressive to me. So let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Stay tuned.
Are you looking for the highest quality herbal supplements and remedies for your home apothecary? Or maybe you're looking to take your spellcraft, magical workings, or offerings to the next level. Whatever your reasons might be, we have hundreds of herbal spagyric items available, and every purchase supports our work and helps bring spagyria into the light of the modern world. Here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, we produce dozens and dozens of items of spagyric pharmacopoeia each year, even though we only need a few samples for our research purposes. So the remaining quantities are available to the public in our online spagyric apothecary. Only the highest quality natural, organic, biodynamic, and ethically wildcrafted materials go into our products, and every purchase you make helps fund our research. As an Alchemi-Culture podcast listener, you can get your hands on our professionally crafted small batch spagyric products for 15% off using coupon code LISTEN15. So go ahead and browse our enormous selection of products and get yourself something new, or pick up one of your favorite products today. Visit phoenixaurelius.org/apothecary and enter coupon code LISTEN15 to take 15% off your entire order. And thanks in advance for supporting our research.
All right, guys, thank you for joining us today. We're back from the break, obviously. We've been chatting with Dan Olsen Right before we went to the break, we were actually just talking about how he got into teaching and his work that he's currently doing with Traditions Education. He was also talking about teaching at Brad Wade's event, which is Fire to Fire, which is where I just met Dan and actually got to work with him. You know, while I was observing you, I took, for those of you who aren't familiar with primitive skills gatherings, they're usually about a week long, and you have about 5 really heavy, hot days of classes that you can take with a lot of people, especially at Fire to Fire. It was like a Monday through Friday type of thing. I took Dan's bladesmithing course, made my own knife. In fact, I've got that on me right now. I can show that to the audience. I don't go anywhere without this blade now. This is such a point of accomplishment, man.
Is that sheath working for you?
The sheath is working great, yeah. So, and the only thing that I would have done different, which, like you said, it's my first knife. It's not my last knife. I love these finger grooves that I have in it. I just wish that I would have maybe made the handle a little bit thicker. It does fit in the hand really nice, and I can put my thumb on the back of the blade and create a lot of control with it. But there's a particular technique to holding it that I wish I would have created my handle just a little bit thicker. But I also made a bow with Dan, carved out of a hickory stave, and then we also made rabbit sticks too. And so the bow making and the rabbit sticks were on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the bladesmithing was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. And I worked my butt off. It was crazy, but I wasn't the only one. And in fact, it was so surprising to me, Dan, because there were people of all ages, like especially in the bladesmithing class. Like we had some kids that looked to me, I'd never asked their age, but they looked somewhere around 9 to 12 years old, maybe. And then we also had adults, well into their 40s and 50s. And the way that you interacted with everybody was so amazing to me. And what was really amazing was that you were so spot on with your memory about where everybody was at in their projects, what their project looked like, everything throughout all 3 of the classes. That was just really amazing. The level of attention and dedication that you offered as a teacher was something that I don't regularly see. And when you said that you teach kids for a living, it just touched my heart so deeply, because this is something that most kids never get, is a quality of education and care from a good majority of their teachers. A lot of teachers are admittedly there for a paycheck. They did it because they have a degree. They went into teaching. They don't know what to do. If they don't do that, they would have to kind of reinvent their lives. I can tell that you come at this from a place of passion. One of the things that you were talking about, which I felt was so important, and I'd like to dive into this a little bit more, was the practicality and hands-on nature of learning. So at Traditions, you actually teach physics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit more about how you teach physics. Like, how would you teach about velocity and curvature and physics and trajectory and all of those things? Like, you were talking about teaching kids with ballistics and stuff, right?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's what we call my physics class. We call it ballistics. It's applied physics. So if we can step back just a little bit, the human
Please.
brain is phenomenal at learning. We're really good at learning. But if we lean on this ancestral philosophy, the philosophy that as humans, we come from somewhere, right? We didn't just spring into life with an iPad in our hands and whatever else, right? We come from somewhere. And that history does kind of influence the way I teach. So our ancestors, the way you learn from your grandmas and aunts and dads and all these other people, the way you learn from them was by being with them and doing things with them. You learned cooking by being at your mom's elbow while she was cutting up the things and cooking. You learn hunting by going hunting. So you learn not by sitting and listening to people talk about it, although I have a whole other conversation about storytelling that's really kind of fun.
Right.
But you learned by doing. And so as humans, the least effective of ways that we often learn is by sitting and listening. We're very visual and we're very hands-on, and our brains struggle to focus on things if we're not doing something with it. Even as our species has kind of gotten to where we are, during the long winters when there was nothing really to do but sit around, we would still do things. We would still work while somebody sat in front of the fire and told stories. We always did something with our hands. So if you're one of those people who can't sit still, even when watching TV, and you have to have something with your hands, that's because that's part of who we are as humans. Keeping our hands busy is part of who we are. So that influences the way I teach. So when we go back to this ballistics class, the very first thing that we want people to be able to do is understand the language. Because if I start throwing words at them like velocity and mass and any of these other things, and they don't know the language, then it doesn't matter what I say.
Yeah, it's just too heady, and it's above, it goes right in one ear and out the other.
Right. And it might make me look good, right? And they might be like, well, he's super smart. I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah.
He seems like he knows, right? Well, that doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't help them, and they don't progress. So we want them to learn the language. So we spend time teaching them the words. For example, we want them to have a physical context for the words and visual anchor points so that they know what the word means. As babies, that's how we learn language.
Yeah.
So when we're teaching the physics class, we start out from the very first day learning about the different laws of motion. We talk about how those laws of motion work, and then we go and experience the laws of motion. So for example, an object at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by an outside force, or an object in motion will remain in motion. Well, we go out and we put objects in motion. We take an object with less mass and we get that moving and see how far it goes. When we get an object with more mass, we actually threw an anvil this last year, which is super fun. And we get that moving, and you realize that the object with more mass is harder to get moving and harder to stop.
Yeah.
And those are things that we kind of know intuitively. When we're teaching the students about trajectory and those kinds of things, we use arrows, and we do archery in the physics class. We do shoot rockets. We talk about some of these other principles of drag and those kinds of things and how they work. But we don't just talk about it, we do it. So whenever you're learning a concept, if there's not something that you can do in relationship with it, then it's really hard to continue to understand that language. And then just like we're teaching any other language, we use it over and over and over again. And we use those words and we remind them what those words mean. And we invite them to use the words. So we have kids, I think this last year, the youngest kids I worked with were 7-year-olds. 6 and 7-year-olds. And these kids, they knew the laws of motion like better than most adults, to be honest. And they could recite them, but not because they had just memorized them, but because they knew what they meant. And that was really important. And they had fun. And here's a weird thing about human brains. The human brain, we have those two parts. We have our rational thinking brain. We have more of our survival, fight or flight type brain. Well, if humans are in a place where they're curious and playful, their brain is really working. That part of their rational brain is really, really working. If they are feeling stress and anxiety because you're making them sit still for long periods of time, or you're threatening them with tests, or if you don't learn this, I'm going to be so mad, or I don't know, whatever, right? If you do any of those things, then you're going to switch their brains, which go into fight or flight really quickly, or that fight, flight, or freeze, right? You're going to switch it into that so fast that their poor little brains just won't absorb anything. But at the same time, kids are natural learners, and they learn through play and through experience. And they're like that from the minute they're born. They're experiencing the world, and you get to really see it come around when they're a few months old, but it continues to grow, and it doesn't have to stop. Humans learn naturally through that experience, through play and through being curious. And the funny thing is it's not always easy, but it's always interesting. So by doing that, by taking the learning and putting it into something three-dimensional and tangible, where they're having authentic experiences connected with the education that we're trying to give them, whether it's history or physics or chemistry or language arts or any of those kinds of things, if we can give them that experience, then they're going to learn it really, really well. And the most important thing as teachers is we don't want to steal that from them by making them afraid of learning or making it painful. It can be uncomfortable. Learning sometimes is uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not a big deal, right? But we want that curiosity and that playfulness to always be part of it.
You know, I think that that's really important. You know, going back to my days working with the Alternative Education Resource Organization, or just AERO, there were so many different styles of education that I was really exposed to, you know, free school, Montessori schools, Waldorf education, schools that would just kind of hodgepodge lots of different types of philosophies together in a way that worked and met the demands of what their community needed, and so on and so forth. You know, various types of out-of-the-box homeschooling and all these other things. It seems like, from what I'm ascertaining from you, that Traditions Education has kind of done that very same thing, is take the elements of education that work, don't necessarily stay inside of a box, focus on the kids and how to be able to make the information relevant and fun and interesting to drive that neuroplasticity to levels that you can't possibly see in conventional education. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think you summarized that really well. Our goal is not necessarily to adhere to a particular dogma. I have Montessori training and Waldorf training. I am not a certified teacher, although I've done an enormous amount of learning in how to become a teacher. From the beginning, though, my goal has been, how do I become the most effective teacher? And there's a huge amount of research that supports this particular method. And in fact, if you go to a public school and you ask any of the teachers there, what's the most effective way to teach? They will repeat the same kind of things that I'm saying. Unfortunately, those poor teachers are in a situation where they're underfunded and they have too many students, and they are so restricted by this huge bureaucracy that they don't have the freedom to work in the way that they know works.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of sympathy. And I personally, even though I've decided to make teaching kind of my life's work, I wouldn't do it in that environment. You couldn't pay me enough. I have a lot of sympathy for them, because I know that they know what works best, and I know that they are often frustrated, even though they're working hard to make it the best possible experience they can for their students.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because we were talking with Lindsay Sharman. She runs Rogue Ways, but she was a high school teacher in a very conventional high school and middle school teacher. And I mean, she's taught all sorts of different types of grades, but it just a couple of episodes ago, that's exactly what we were talking about. And it ended up, you know, we were talking about what didn't work for her, and why do we think that the public school system as it currently stands today in so many places, because every public school is actually different, but why does it not necessarily work for the majority of our students? Why do we have so many dropouts? Why do we have so many people who are struggling, lack of people who are interested in learning or who even understand how to learn? That's the biggest thing. You know, school should be to teach us how to learn. And at the forefront of that, this is probably why I was so impressed with the way that you teach, is the engagement of it. If people can be engaged, curiosity takes over, and learning is something that happens as a byprocess of the curiosity that is inherent to the human condition, not necessarily something that feels like it's laborious or tedious or something that needs to be done, but something that wants to be engaged in. Do you find that a lot with your students, that they want to learn more, that they want to go deeper with these things once you teach various subjects?
We really do find that. But here's the challenge we run into, depending on when we get them. So
enough.
if I have a student at Starry Garden, those kids started with us sometimes as young as 3 years old. And if I had that student all the way through 5th grade, then they were just natural learners. And many of those kids were reading at a college level. And then I just sat back and let them research the heck out of stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's certain things that was just a little bit out of reach because they hadn't matured enough or developed enough that they fully understood it. They were so hungry all the time. On the other hand, as you were talking, I just got thinking about this a little bit. I had some kids that were middle school and high school this last year. And when we started working on math, man, you would see their whole disposition change.
Yeah.
They went from being curious and interested to being like, oh, math, which is so sad because math is the language of the universe, right?
Yeah,
and we are residents of the universe, and we should know that language. It is so cool. Math is really exciting. I actually wasn't a great math student when I was in high school. And then part of the reason I wasn't is because I just didn't realize how interesting and fun it is.
Same.
It wasn't until I was in college, actually, I was taking a trigonometry class, and I was like, this is horrible. I don't understand any of this. This is meaningless to me. And I failed my first trigonometry class. And I thought, man, what am I going to do, right? So I went back to retake the class, and in the very first class, the professor stood up and began talking about the history of trigonometry. And she talked about how trigonometry was used in ship navigation, celestial navigation. I was like, whoa, how come nobody told me this? Celestial navigation is so cool.
Yeah.
So I skipped the next 2 weeks of class, and I spent that time in the library learning about celestial navigation. And then I came back to class and I understood the language they were speaking.
Yep.
I understood the sine and cosine and the coefficients and why those worked and their relationships. And it made so much sense to me. So when I have these kids who come in who have, we call it the ghosts of education past, who have had these really tough experiences with learning, which, learning can be hard, but it shouldn't be painful. And I say that a lot, where they had just been told that they were bad at math.
Right.
Like you can be good or bad at it. And that's not real, right?
No, that's not a real perception.
You've either learned it or you haven't learned it.
Yeah.
And learning it comes through a lot of different methods. And so over time, we were able to explore math with them and take a step back from the memorizing formulas and equations and that kind of thing. Just step back and let's experience the math. Let's understand how it works in the real world and in 3 dimensions. And let's talk about why we want to use this kind of math and how interesting it is. They're not going to believe me that it's fun until they've had that opportunity to get through and have it not be painful, right? Painful things are not fun yet.
Well, especially if you don't have any end goal in mind. Like, for instance, you could go to the gym every day. Well, this goes back to your days of coaching triathletes.
Yeah.
The pain actually leads to the gain, which leads to better ability to compete and to have a better chance at winning and doing something that is personally meaningful, showing your skill to yourself, to others, whatever that drive may be. But I think that's really important. Like yourself, it wasn't with trigonometry. For me, it was physics that changed everything for me. In high school, I was taking calculus classes and, trying to get as far as I could because my senior year of high school, I was already enrolled in a lot of different college courses, namely for linguistics and foreign languages. I had already, by the time I was a junior, I had already gone through the highest level high school Spanish that there could possibly be. And I started in French 3 my very first year, just because I understood the concepts of it. And so I was, by my senior year, I was already taking concurrent enrollment courses with Weber State University up here in Ogden. But I was taking the most advanced math classes that I possibly could because it looks good on my transcripts. I was going for full ride scholarship for linguistics and other things. And you typically, in the world of academia, you want to show that you're a very well-rounded student.
Mhm.
Well, I just couldn't understand why they had me plotting points on hyperboles and trying to calculate this really nonsense material. It's like, when will this actually ever come in handy? And even the physics teacher that we had at my high school, his name was Mr. Lindsay. He was a fantastic teacher. Unfortunately, I didn't get him, and I got a brand new teacher fresh out of college named Mrs. O'Toole. We never did enough labs, and we never made the math that we had to do relevant. It was always just memorizing formulas, and then the tests were these long, grueling 5-page things just full of arbitrary formulas.
Mhm.
When I got into college, kind of like your experience with trig, I had a professor who was amazing. She showed us waves and how to plot waves and understand wavelength and all these other things by teaching us with singing bowls and how to hammer out singing bowls. She taught us, all of these really amazing things in a down-to-earth, practical environment that made all of the calculus training that I had all of a sudden relevant and fun.
Mhm.
And it made all of those equations make sense, because you can understand something practically without understanding it philosophically. In fact, the majority of what are perhaps unduly called uncivilized cultures or primitive cultures, that's what they do. They understand the practicality behind it, not so much the science or the philosophy behind why it happens. Oftentimes it's given, this kind of mystical association or mystical reasoning. And it's so cool once you learn the mathematical language, because then you can take it to entirely new levels and perfect the craft of what you were doing in ways that were completely unprecedented before. And so while you were talking, that reminded me of my experience. Was just like, it mirrors the exact same thing.
Yeah, I really think about that, and with things like physics in particular, I something I say quite often is, if you are taking a physics class and something is not flying through the air, then you're doing it wrong. Because
Yeah,
physics is the science of movement, right?
yeah,
And so stuff better be moving, you
yeah,
know? It's funny you mentioned some of the ancestral or ancient cultures, how they understood things from a practical level. The rabbit sticks, or the hunting boomerangs,
right.
is one of my favorite examples of that. The level of understanding of aerodynamic principles that goes into making a good boomerang or a good rabbit stick is really, really amazing. And the fact that without any other knowledge besides cultural experience, these people all over the world in several different settings and environments were able to um, create these tools that work so effectively. In fact, so effectively that there has never been a time in human history that we know of that they haven't been part of our history,
Yeah,
even our from all the way up to modern history, where these tools are used the way they are. But the fact that they understood airfoils so
yeah.
well, to the point that they could use them to hunt animals in motion, is just amazing. And
Uh,
as you say, once we begin to really understand it, then we can start doing some cool things with it. And if
yes,
we understand the math behind it. But when was the last time you were in an algebra class and somebody was like, well, let's talk about hunting with rabbit sticks. Let's
exactly.
really get into this. Or the I think often about the sophistication of composite bows that are made with horn
Yeah,
and sinew and wood, and the level of sophistication there is phenomenal. And I thought, man, how did they go from making these wood bows all the way to this level? And it came through a deep understanding of the world around them. They understood the animals and the plants and the trees, and all of the things that came together. And that was their material. That's what they had to work with. But they understood it at such a level that some of the most amazing bows are these ones made out of doll sheep horns, that are
yeah,
sinew
yeah.
backed doll sheep horns. And at some point, some guy along the lines was like, hey, you know what? I bet this would make a really cool bow. Who knows when, right?
Seriously though, yeah.
But when you understand those concepts of compression and tension and some of the things that are going on there, and not just the fact that there's compression and tension in a bow, but that you have to have a very specific mathematical curve from the handle to the tips to get it to bend evenly, and be able to reproduce that over and over again in a way that was effective enough that you could feed or defend your family with it. Wow, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
I struggled to log into our meeting today because I do not have a deep understanding of Zoom conferences. Fortunately, I understand bows and rabbit sticks a little bit better.
That's good. Everybody's got their area of expertise, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Let's actually go ahead and take a break. When we come back, let's talk a little bit more about some of the bows, and because you are a professional bowyer, you make bows for people. You also make knives for people. I want to get into a little bit more of that. So let's take a break, and we'll chat more about that when we come back. Stay tuned.
In today's age of rampant toxicity, it's important to have effective products at your disposal to maintain balance and well-being. One of the best products I've come across in over 15 years of actively looking for the best of the best for myself and my family is Zach Bush's Ion Biome products. Ion Gut Health in particular supports the body's production of beneficial enzymes through cellular communication. These enzymes help support the seals between the cells in your gut lining, thereby giving you a first-line defense against invading toxins like the infamous glyphosate that's so notorious for completely destroying gut microbiome health. The most recent scientific studies suggest that somewhere around 70% of the human immune system is built in the gut and the gut lining, and this barrier is critical for your total well-being. So if you're anything like me and you care about the total health of you and your family, then do yourself a favor and order some Ion Gut Health today. Visit phoenixaurelius.org, scroll to the media tab, and select the Alchemi-Culture podcast page. From there, you'll see a link for Ion Biome's Ion Gut Health. And as with all the links on our podcast page, this company offers us a small percentage of sales to help support our research and make this podcast a possibility.
We're back from the break. We're here with Dan Olsen. We have been chatting about education. We've been chatting about lots of very fun and interesting things. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, because this is maybe one of your areas of professional expertise, in fact, the things that people are going to know you for the most, is your work with bladesmithing, your work with Bowyery, also your work with basketry. Let's talk about bladesmithing first. First of all, how did you get into bladesmithing?
So I, like any boy, I got my first pocket knife, I think when I was 8 years old. I was living up in Alaska, got it for my 8th birthday, and that opened the world for me. Of course, I cut myself right away and got that out of the way quickly, like you do. But that became kind of my way to interact with the world around me in different ways. And so I can hardly think of a time in my life where I haven't had a knife with me. The one exception is I occasionally have to travel and get on airplanes. I have some funny stories about pre-9/11 airplane kind of things and being allowed on airplanes with very large knives, which was just nuts when you think about it. But they've always been something that I've been connected with. So when I was 14, my family did this. My parents were teachers, so our summers were often spent traveling. When I wasn't working in construction, we were traveling. So we did this big trip where we drove through the Midwest all the way back to New York. And on the way, we did this big loop. On the way out there, we stopped in several historical sites, living history type places. And one of those places was Nauvoo, Illinois. And there they had a blacksmith. And I thought, man, I didn't even know people did this anymore. This is so cool. It was amazing. And at that point, he wasn't making knives. He was just blacksmithing. But, you know, when you're growing up, you see the movies where they make the hero sword or whatever, and they blacksmith out the sword. And it's just really cool. Of course, there's so many fallacies in movies.
Oh, yeah. It's ridiculous.
But, you know, that's Hollywood.
It's movies.
Right?
It's entertainment. It's not historically accurate. It's not meant
to. No. And so there was that part of me that was like, man, it would be so cool to forge my own knife. So that same year, I had figured out through talking to some of these guys at these living history sites, and I'm sure they got tired of me, but actually, maybe they didn't, because they seemed very eager to share information with me. Through talking to them, I knew that I needed a hammer and an anvil-like object and something to heat it up with. And that's all I knew. And so I was very resourceful. I'd been studying traditional skills since I was a kid. So I raided my dad's shed, and I found a little crossbeam sledgehammer. And I can't remember what I was using for an anvil, but I think it might have been an old piece of railroad track.
Oh, yeah.
And so then I couldn't find an oxygen source to get the fire really hot, but I had dug this pit in our backyard. We're out in the Nevada desert, so nobody cared that I was building a fire in the backyard. So I dug this pit in the backyard and filled it with charcoal, and I stole my mom's hairdryer and got this hairdryer and used that to heat up the fire and get it hot enough. It wasn't a real blower or anything, right? It was just a hairdryer on some coals and a piece of rebar or something like that. And I got into it, and I started hammering on this thing, and it never actually turned into a knife that first time. I did get in trouble, by the way, for stealing my mom's hairdryer. She did buy me another one though later. She was like, "Here's your own hairdryer, Dan. Do whatever you want with it." Very
supportive.
And but I just beat on this piece of metal until it was flatter, and I was so hooked. I don't know how long I was out there. It felt like maybe 15 minutes, but it probably ended up being several hours. And I couldn't stand and do it. So I was kneeling in the dirt and hammering on this railroad track. And luckily none of the neighbors were very close, because that probably would have been shut down a lot faster. But I was really fortunate that I was able to experiment with that. And so from there, I just continued to learn what I could. Of course, this was pre-internet and pre-YouTube, so there wasn't a lot of sources out there, and you couldn't even find books on the subject. I'd go to the library and try and find books, and you couldn't find books. Wow. It was this small town library in the middle of Nevada, right? So they just didn't have the information. So a lot of it was just kind of learning by doing. My dad was a school teacher, but during the summers, he was a building contractor. And so he would build and remodel homes. And from the time I was 14, I worked with him over the summer. So I was very comfortable with a hammer in my hand, and built a lot of good muscle memory and that kind of thing through the process. So this went on off and on for many years of me just trying to figure things out and experiment with them. About the time I was in my early 20s, I became friends with a guy who was a farrier, a horseshoer.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, you like to blacksmith? Let me show you some stuff." And that was the real transition for me, where I went from hammering out a lot of things really badly to hammering out still a lot of things not as badly. One of the things I often like to tell people, and I said this to you, it's not your first knife, right? My first knife was way worse than your first knife. And the thing is, as you're doing that, if you're comfortable with being bad at things, then eventually you can get really good at it. But you have to be comfortable being bad at it for a long time. For me, it was many, many years of being really bad at it. So then working with him, that was the real transition, where then I was able to take those skills that he taught me and begin to transition that into knife making. And that's when I first started making knives that I felt like were okay, pretty decent knives. I was very proud of myself. I still have a few of those that I keep around to remind me kind of where I've come from.
Yeah.
So through that process, eventually people but actually I had a neighbor come over one day while I was working and say, "Well, what are you doing?" There's smoke and fire coming from my house. So it was nice of him to come check on me. And I showed him, and he was like, wow, you make knives? That's so cool. And I, felt awkward and whatever, but he said, "Can you make me a knife?" And we were able to kind of talk about it. And so I think a lot of us who've gotten into bladesmithing, go through a phase where we're a little embarrassed by what we're making, and we enjoy the process, but we're not so much about wanting to sell it necessarily.
Sure, yeah.
And then we get to a point where people are like, well, hey, that's pretty nice. You know, I'll buy that. I'll pay you for that. And of course, we don't know what to charge for it or anything like that. And so you go through a time period where you charge way less than anything you make is worth.
Yes.
And so there's that long process. But over time, over several years, I got to a point where in order to progress further in this hobby that I had to improve the equipment that I had. So I had been using a coal forge for most of my career. The thing about coal is it takes a long time to heat up and it takes a long time to cool down. So when you're working on it, it's a day-long commitment.
Yeah.
And so I switched over to propane because you can turn it on and turn it off, which is really nice. That was a big transition. And then I purchased a 2x72 belt grinder, which took me from being able to take a week to make a knife to being able to turn one out in around a day, depending on the type of knife I was making. And so that became the real game changer for me. And at that point, my wife and I had a long conversation, because these kind of tools are not cheap necessarily. The grinder is $1,700. We had a conversation about, maybe I want to spend a little bit of my time making and selling knives and do this semi-professionally. And she said, well, you kind of do it anyway, so you might as well keep doing it. If you make some money to pay for all the stuff you use, then that's all the better, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, I kind of went through that. And so I'd post pictures of the knives I was making on social media. And to my surprise, maybe more than anyone else's, people asked to buy them. And I'd say, well, okay. Not selling the knife. But once we had decided to make that transition, I decided to form the company 4D Blades. And when I did that, I did some market research. I have a background in marketing and business development. And I did some market research and found out what people were really looking for in a knife. And I summarized that as the 4Ds. That's detail, durability, design, and of course, because I'm telling you about it, I can't remember all four of them.
It's funny the way that one works.
Yeah, dependability. There's the fourth D. Yep.
Right.
Dependability, detail, design, and durability. And so I put that into everything that I made, whether it was the leather sheaths. I taught myself how to do leather work. Started doing that as a young man as well. And so the leather sheaths, I wanted them to be something that I could be proud of, that would be an heirloom, like the stuff that I had seen in the museums that was hundreds of years old. And I thought, man, it'd be so cool if hundreds of years from now, one of my knives was in a museum, or it had been passed down to family members. One of the things that really hooked me was I started having people ask me to do heirloom knives, memorial type knives. There was one set that I did for a gentleman where we incorporated some things from his past and his relationship with his father. I was able to use his dad's old gun scabbard to make part of the sheath, a big old leather gun scabbard, and the antlers from the first deer that they shot on their first hunting trip together.
That's cool.
And that was just so cool. And then other guys would come and they'd have the ivories from their first elk, and they'd want that inlaid in the handle. And so making these functional works of art really spoke to me. And of course, there's a certain level of that curiosity and that hunger that I have to learn that plays a big part in this, because every knife that I make is custom and they're all different. And because of that, there's a learning curve with each one. You get better over time and it gets easier to make new knives each time. But there's always going to be a little bit of, well, what's the best way to get the result that I'm looking for here?
Yeah.
So that's been a really fun process. And of course, I continue to do it now. Right before our COVID situation, I began looking at expanding the business and producing more handmade production knives. And so we had put out a line of fillet knives the young man I had working with me, really cool, hardworking guy, had a background as a traditional blacksmith, but not a bladesmith. And he was making some really good knives. And so we were able to do those. Right around the time COVID happened, he was living up there in the Ogden area, and had just gotten married, so he couldn't travel back and forth, and we ended up having to shut that down. But it looks like we will be bringing that back in here in the near future.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we're hoping. And then we can produce some of these handmade knives for a little bit cheaper than doing a lot of one-off knives.
Yeah. Well, okay. So listening to you, I've got quite a few things that I wanted to break down and kind of unpack. First of all, going to Nauvoo, I'm assuming that had a lot to do with your faith and faith history. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you who are listening, don't know Nauvoo, that's where the first LDS temple was built. That's also where Joseph Smith actually ended up dying, and where Brigham Young continued in that lineage, bringing people out to Utah. And so it's a huge site of pilgrimage. Just like for Muslims, it's Mecca. Nauvoo is a huge site of pilgrimage for most people in the LDS faith. So that's really cool that you actually got to have that experience as a kid, going there and working with the blacksmiths, which was so contemporaneous and necessary as a skill during the life of the LDS prophet Joseph Smith. And so I think that was absolutely awesome. That's super cool opportunity and experience.
Well, they said the blacksmith was the heart of the town.
Yeah.
Because no other trade could function without the blacksmith.
It's true.
Your cobbler couldn't do it without the hammer and nails. Your farrier, of course, couldn't do it without the horseshoes. The wagon wrights couldn't make wagons without the parts from the blacksmith. So, as you say, it was an essential part of life back then.
Oh, it's so essential. Here in Utah, we've got this large amusement park called Lagoon. Of course, you're probably intimately familiar with Lagoon, having lived in Utah yourself.
I tried to avoid it.
Yeah, exactly. I tried to avoid it too, but as a kid, it was always something that, that's where you go to have a little bit of fun, and parents typically feel free, leaving you there with a friend or two, and you can just run amok. But they've got this cool area in there, which I still, when I do go, this is where I spend almost all my time, is at Pioneer Village, where they have all these old actual historic pioneer cabins and furniture and all these things. And they have an actual blacksmith cabin out there with all of these original tools from the 1800s, from the mid to late 19th century, that are just so well preserved. And it's just so cool to see and connect with that. And as a really young kid, that was part of what got me very interested in blacksmithing, and always, having that as a lifelong dream. Is like, it's someday I'm going to get into it. And finally, fire was the moment I did it. It was a dream come true for me. But
are you familiar with This Is the Place Monument Park in Salt Lake?
Yeah, I am. I've never actually been there, but I understand.
Think of the Pioneer Village, but it covers several acres. It's enormous.
Oh, man,
they have a saddlery, and they have an herb apothecary there.
Oh, brilliant!
And of course, the blacksmith shop and that sort of thing. Yeah, it's worth the visit.
Man, that whole time period was just so idyllic to me. It was, you had the Enlightenment happening. You had so many different types of philosophies and ways of life, but things were still moving slowly. You still had to move by horse and buggy, or train, which was a relatively newer thing that was coming on the scene. It's so fascinating to me. I just really love that time period. But I'll stop being so romantic about that time period, because the next thing I wanted to talk about was the work with the farriers. I noticed during my time working with you that you have more rasps than I've seen anybody have ever. Was that working with the farriers the first time that you realized, like, oh wow, these rasps, they can go a really long way. Like, we can use them on bows, we can use them on rabbit sticks and wood projects after they're done with being used, serving their lifespan on hooves. And then you give them life to blades after that and kind of immortalize them. Is that kind of where your inspiration came
that's a
through?
fun process. So I was first exposed to the farrier's rasps working with farriers. I didn't do a lot of the horseshoeing or that kind of thing. But very quickly, because I was into making bows, I a farrier would throw away a rasp, and they need to be really sharp for horseshoeing in order to be effective in what you're doing there. And so they'd throw one in a bucket, and I'd say, well, hey, can I have that? Because it was, it was good enough for what I wanted to do with it for making bows, or the rabbit sticks and that kind of thing. And they'd say, oh yeah, I'm just going to throw it away, right? And I'd be like, wow, okay, cool.
Thank you.
$30 something a piece. And so I okay, great, thanks. Well, after a while, I started just collecting a lot of them. I have more than I can count right now, to be honest, but it's because I just continually collect them. But what really happened was I had this old cowboy friend of mine who is just really a neat guy. He was worked for the Forest Service when he was younger, and then he became an English teacher, and he spent a huge amount of his life teaching. Then he retired and continued educating because he doesn't know how to stop working or educating. So he spent the last 20 something years of his life robbing the train up in Heber City, the Heber Creeper, as dressed up in period correct clothing and that kind of thing. Well, he and I became friends through some of the blacksmithing stuff. He had questions about some tools that he had found on his property, and so we got chatting about them and kind of got to know each other that way. Well, through a series of different things, he had asked me about a farrier's rasp, if that would make a good knife. And I was like, oh yeah. And I showed him one. He was like, oh, that's so cool. And so we got talking about it, and I said, well, here, I'll make you a deal. These farrier's rasps are, they're worth something, and I'll use them. I said, if you'll bring me a 5-gallon bucket full of these, I'll give you a knife. I'll trade you. And he's retired. He's got all the time in the world on his hands. He went to every old cowboy that he knew and every farrier that he knew and everything else. Well, he comes back and he's got buckets full of these rasps. And he was like, well, you think this is enough? And I was like, oh, sure. And that's the thing, I'll make a few knives out of farrier's rasps every year, and they make really good quality knives. But the reality is it'll take me a lifetime to make enough knives out of all these rasps. So anyway, of course I made him a knife, and I think I'd shown you the knife that I made for him. It's the one that I brought to fire.
Well, and it still actually had some really cool designs from where the rasps actually are. That was really rad.
Yeah, it just looks so cool. And it's there's some historical precedence for that. There's some people that say that one of Jim Bowie's first knives was actually made out of a farrier's rasp. We don't have that particular knife anymore. Well, actually, there's the one that he had at the Alamo, and we do have that one. They think that was made from a file or farrier's rasp of some type. So there's some historical precedence for that. But yeah, they're really cool. And as you say, we use them. Once we've used them for horseshoeing, then we use them for making bows. We use them for making rabbit sticks, and on and on. In fact, the pieces that I cut off the rasp to make knives out of, we use those little extra pieces, and we make flint strikers for starting fires and that kind of thing. So we're able to really utilize that tool, and as you say, immortalize it in some ways, because those things last forever.
Man, that's really cool. So I'm assuming that because it's already more or less a forged piece of steel, that working from a rasp like that would be significantly less work than what we ended up doing at Fire to Fire, because you can just pound it to get, kind of get that bevel on it, and then take it to the
well, with farrier's rasps, we have to use almost an entirely different technique. I'll do a little bit of forging with them, but they're already a flat piece of metal.
Right.
So we anneal them, we soften them in the forge, and then after they've been annealed, we'll grind all the little teeth off, and then we use a method called stock removal versus forging. So stock removal is basically you cut out the shape and then grind the bevels, and that's it. It's really
Wow.
I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's a much simpler
It's
process than
easier.
taking
Yeah.
that little 1 by 6 inch piece of steel that you started with. So the reason we do that rather than forging it to shape is because those little divots that are left behind where the teeth were,
Yep.
if you forge those and you get those closed shut, it creates something called a cold shut, which can be a weak point or a stress riser for that knife. And it can actually cause that knife to crack either in the heat treat process or later when you are using the knife. And when you think about having a knife break while somebody is using it, the risk for injury is really high. And as a bladesmith, it's something that we constantly want to be aware of, that we don't want someone to get hurt because one of our knives didn't work the way it was supposed to. So we use a completely different method with the farrier's rasp. And it takes some time. And to be honest, a lot of the commercially made knives are made using the stock removal method. Almost none of them are made with a forged. You'll find them every once in a while, but very rarely are production knives made that way.
Yeah. Well, and understandably so. They would be actually pretty cost prohibitive, you know?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Do you do any smelting and molding of knives, before they go to the forge, like kind of getting a basic shape, or is that from what I understand, smelting actually removes a lot of that carbon from the steel, so it'd make it a hard.
So that's one of those inaccuracies that you see in movies all the time, right? Where they'll have this mold, this stone mold or whatever, and they pour the molten metal into the mold and it's glowing and it looks awesome.
Yeah.
You don't make knives or swords that way. You might be familiar with bloomery iron or tomahawk, Japanese steel. And so the process of taking your mineral iron to an iron that you can forge and then converting that into a steel, it's kind of a long process. And heat will steal that carbon. It will rob the carbon from the steel. So as we're forging, you'll get little flaky bits off the side, which we call forge scale. And those are essentially a cast iron. They're a very, very hard carbon poor piece of iron. And so we don't do a lot of casting of steel, or we don't use a foundry or that kind of thing with steel. We do use that when we're working with some of the more white metal type things, like your copper and brass and some of those, silver, of course. And so sometimes we'll do that in processes where we need a piece to go on a knife, whether it's a guard or the butt or that kind of thing with the knife. But even then, there's methods that we use with that where they are sometimes forged. For example, copper, we will forge copper sometimes, but the process is very different because of, well, really it's the chemical structure, the crystalline structure of the different metals respond differently to different temperatures. So with steel and iron in particular, you can get iron hot enough that you can pour it into a mold, but it wouldn't make a good functional usable knife. And so it's not something that we ever really do. I have been experimenting recently. I found some iron deposits and I've been playing around with going through this process, not because it will ever make me any kind of money, because it's way too expensive and way too time invested in it. So, but the process that goes back and it feeds that curiosity that I have of, and maybe that connection with my past a little bit, right? I have, my ancestors are very much Northern European. You can tell by my last name.
It's a very strong Nordic name.
Yep. Yeah. My dad's ancestry, as far back as we can find, is in Denmark and Switzerland.
Sweden, right? Sweden or Switzerland?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mostly Sweden. We have his DNA says that he's related to the Sami people, the reindeer herders.
Wow,
up there.
yeah.
But as far back as we can have record, we're were Danish. And so that connection with the quote unquote Viking, blacksmiths and the work that they were doing with steel, which, forgive me for saying this because not everybody's going to agree with me, was some of the most amazing stuff that was being done with steel at that time period, long before the Japanese were doing what they were doing.
Well, and the Japanese, their steel was folded because they had really poor quality iron and steel. They had to fold it because it was such poor quality, not because that was a technique that they would have used had they had European grade materials to start with.
Yeah. So, and that's a whole, we could talk about that for hours, but that idea of being able to take a mineral from that very beginning, we now have this rock and eventually it's going to be a steel blade. That process fascinates me. And it's not something I've been able to, I'm hardly an expert there, but I am the kind of person that's constantly pushing the limits of what I know and trying to understand better. And fortunately, there's people who know more than I do about this. So they're people I can go to and learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's true what you said. The Ulfbert style knives or rather swords that Ulfbert, that were coming from the Viking, what we now conceive of as Viking or just Nordic territories, were extremely prized all over Europe during the period of the early medieval ages and late dark ages. So they did have really good quality steel and they were making really awesome. And then, eventually Spanish steel became, exceptionally popular because they figured out really great ways of infusing carbon into there. So it made it, strong and basically made the Armada and, the conquistadors a possibility. So yeah, that's all really fascinating stuff. Well, you also make bows though for people. I've seen you recently actually making some Plains Indian style bows. Is that true?
Yeah, that's been a lot of fun. I was out, you might have seen the video, but I was out testing those the other day.
I did.
And they're just so much fun. These short little bows, they're very, very snappy,
They are,
So
yeah.
when we're building a bow, we go back to the physics, right? Because physics is the language, and math are the language of the universe. So but understanding the physics helps you understand how that bow is going to work, and the limb speed, how quickly it returns back to its point. That velocity has everything to do with the eventual momentum of the arrow. Of course, the mass of the arrow matters as well, but it has a lot to do with the eventual momentum of the arrow. And those short bows, because they don't have a lot of mass at the end holding them back, can just really move those arrows fast. So I have that little bow that I just finished is a 35 pound at 23 inches. So we don't have a lot of extra space to build up that momentum, right? And the draw weight isn't really, really heavy. There's a number of historical examples that were much heavier. This one is not sinew backed. I will be doing some that are sinew backed here in the future, but just this little design here, which is a close replica of some of the museum examples, it gives you an opportunity to kind of explore and understand what these people were looking for. So they needed a bow that could take down a buffalo and also be used on horseback.
Yeah,
that's a big deal. So it needed to be short but reasonably powerful. And so there's some really fun things that go into it. For example, the bow bends through the handle in order to use that extra space as working space. You don't have the freedom to put a nice thick handle on it where it won't bend, because then you'll put too much stress on those limbs. So yeah, those bows are a lot of fun. I have a couple more in the works. I'm doing a little Plains Indian style bow that has recurve tips, and then I'm going to be doing one that is more of a reflex deflex style out of some choke cherry. But that one will be sinew backed for a friend of mine. So yeah, they're a lot of fun. We were talking about the Viking time period and some of those Indo-European groups that were in that area. And they have some really, really cool bow designs that when you're thinking of it from a design perspective or understanding of the the physics of how a bow works. They're really amazing. There's one called the Home Guard, and I'm not pronouncing that as well as you would, but
Not a
Home
linguist. Guard. Don't worry. Everybody's got their specialties.
Yeah. But that bow is really, really an interesting design. I've done a few of those. It's one of my favorite longbow designs. But those are really a cool bow design because of how they work. They have a long lever arm at the tips that is not a bending bow, but it's also not a recurve bow. I think the next natural step from there would probably be a recurve style bow. But then we can look at the history and understand that sinew backing a bow in that part of Europe wouldn't have made sense.
Yeah.
And also in Great Britain, where we had the English.
Too much humidity, right?
Yeah, too much humidity. You just wouldn't have gotten the extra benefit out of it. There's some people, and of course, I'm not suggesting that this is historically accurate, but there are conversations in the bow making community that feel like that was one of the factors that stopped the Mongol invasion, because their bows stopped working the way they were supposed to. And so all of these people in the forests of Europe with these long bows were able to, and there's a lot more history than just this one piece, but were able to continue to defend themselves from these Mongols who were coming in and invading during that time period. So
yeah. But you get out of that dry, arid climate, and all of a sudden your bow doesn't have the same snap. The sinew is coming off, you know, and
not to mention they were getting into more forested areas, and that affected their combat style. Not, you know, the reality though is they were pretty formidable group coming into to Europe there, and they conquered an awful lot of it.
Sure
and
did.
So there's other factors as well, but there's conversation that is one of the factors. So, and actually you see that repeated in the Americas, where the East Coast Indians had longbows that were very recognizable as longbows to the Europeans who were coming through. In fact, a lot of the British colonists recognized that these guys were excellent archers and bow makers, and respected them for that. And then when you head out west, to the drier, more arid places, that's where we start seeing sinew-backed bows. But we don't see that in the eastern woodlands or in the southeast or those kinds of areas. They stuck with the long self bows, the all wood bows. In fact, the bow that you made at Fire to Fire was more of a Cherokee style bow.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be, you know, I mean, obviously it's not sinew backed. It's going to be one of those bows that you get a piece of wood. It's going to work really well in humidity, and it should work equally as well in an arid environment. So
a little bit better, in fact.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's just because the wood won't take on as much humidity and therefore has more tension to it as you're in the draw weight, or how does that work?
Yes, and also the weight of the limbs. The limbs are lighter weight, therefore they move faster.
That makes sense. Cool. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll go ahead and do our final part of our interview. We'll talk a little bit more about some commission work that you're doing, some of your more fun projects, and then find out how people can get a hold of you if they're interested in bows and knives, and especially education for their kids. So we'll be right back.
Have you heard about our Spagyrics of the Month Club yet? As you probably know, we release 5 new Spagyrics each month. These range in the style of Spagyric pharmacopoeia from tinctures, elixirs, essences, clyci, stones, and much more. But now, you can get your hands on all 5 new releases each month at just a fraction of the normal cost by being part of our Spagyrics of the Month Club. It's the very best way to inexpensively build your home Spagyric apothecary, and it's also the best way to support our research academy. Participating is easy. Sign up for the $75 a month subscription on our website, and we ship you a 4 ml size of all 5 newly released Spagyrics that month. And shipping's even included for all orders within the USA. The best part is, you just sign up once and sit back and receive your new Spagyrics delivered right to your door. It really doesn't get any easier. To get started or to learn more, go to phoenixaurelius.org and scroll down to the Spagyrics of the Month Club area on our homepage. As always, thanks so much for supporting our work.
back from the break, and again, we're here with Dan Olsen. We've been chatting a lot about blades, about education, about bows, all sorts of things. I'm sure that you and I could actually probably go on and on for a long time, Dan. We have many similar interests, and listening to more of your story today as well, it sounds like we have a lot of similar background, or at least takeaways from the experience of learning and education and interest in living history and things like that. But, you know, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the commission work that you've done, some of the more fun projects that you've worked on in the last couple of years. Does anything really stand out to you in terms of knives or bows or even education?
You know, I'm a lucky guy. I get to do the things that I'm really excited and passionate about. So I'd mentioned at the end of the last segment that I was excited about the Nordic history,
Yeah.
and those bows from my ancestral history. So those bows have been really fun. I'm most excited about these Plains Indians bows that I'm working on because I don't have a ton of experience working in this area. So it's a new area to kind of explore and to learn about. And so this is one area. It is a commission that I'm working on. In the process, I want everything that I produce that goes out to somebody to be really high quality.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I've been commissioned to make a pair of bows that are a Lakota Sioux style bow. But in order to get there, I need to be really confident that whatever I send out is going to be really good. So in that process, I'm actually making several bows before I make these and send them out. And so as far as bows go, that's something I'm really excited about, and I'm having a lot of fun taking the skills that I've developed in the past from all of the hundreds of bows that I've made and putting it into this. And of course, with making bows, because we're using natural materials, we never really know for sure what we're going to get. We can guess and we can have experience that helps us kind of get there, but it's hard to know for sure what we're going to get. From the knife perspective, when I think about my knife projects, I've got a number that I had a lot of fun making, and I loved the stories. So I talked a little bit about some of the stories of knives that I had made, and I like to learn from people what's inspired them to commission a knife. So the knives that I make are 100% custom made. What that means is that somebody calls me up and says, okay, so I'm thinking about having a knife made. And I'll say, okay, well, what do you want to use it for? What does it mean to you? What are the goals that we have for this knife? And then through that process of conversing back and forth and me drawing designs and sending them out to them, and we kind of go back and forth, we'll make little tweaks to the designs. I get to know these people, and I get to understand at least that small part of who they are and why that's important to them. And through that process, we come up with something that is super personalized to them. When I think about human history, and of course, I go back to this quite a lot, but from the time before we were even humans, we were using sharp-edged tools. That was part of who we were. So now, making a knife, we're connecting them with all of those millennia of history to those people. It's an extension of who they are.
Yeah.
And so I love that process of personalizing the blade to that person. So there's a couple that stand out to me. We had talked about the farrier's rasps and that kind of thing. There's a gentleman who got in touch with me and asked me if I could make him a Bowie knife. He's an older gentleman. His wife passed away a number of years ago, and he's a collector of Western style stuff, regalia and that kind of thing. He collects old guns, and so he had commissioned this knife, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. And he wanted something that that fit what he was going for, but he couldn't quite put it into words. So through a conversation, I drew him some designs, and I was able to send him the design that I was thinking of, that to make sure that we were on the same page. And he felt really good about that. Then through the process of finishing his knife and getting it out to him, it became kind of a real precious symbol of what he was doing. Most of the knives I make are for people to use. You know, they're going to go out and they're going to clean their deer with it, or they're going to use it in their camp, or they're going to use it for something. This is one of the very few knives that I've made that's probably going to spend its life like a museum piece. But it was an interesting process making that knife and getting to know this gentleman throughout the process. And it's become a centerpiece of his collection, which makes me feel really good. And it was something that I felt really good about as I was making it, and able to fit what he was looking for. Another one that it was a set of knives actually, and it's not a style that I do very often, but they were these big overbuilt Tonto style chopper knives. There was a pair of them, and a gentleman from Ireland had got in touch with me, and he said, "Hey, I'm looking to have these knives made." And he had designed them himself. He was is a soldier, and he was looking for his dream knives, the knives that he just had wanted from forever. Now, he was not an artist, and he was not really experienced in knife design, so he was willing to listen to me as I made some suggestions about changing it, but staying true to that design that he wanted. And so then we got going building the knives, and the knives were coming along really well. And one day I was in a Army surplus store, and I'm walking around and you know, like collecting camping gear or whatever, and I saw these old Navy duffel bags, the kind that, you know, stuff all your gear in before they put you on the ship, right? And I saw those, and I thought, man, it would be really cool to make these into knife handles. So we use this process where we impregnate fabric with resin and press it in a press and make this stuff called micarta. And so I called him up and I said, "Hey, I just found these bags. What do you think? We could make these into the handles." And he was just super excited about that. And so now we have, I ended up finishing these knives, and they're ridiculously big and overbuilt, and not a style that I normally do. But you can chop through a tree with one of these knives, and it will stay sharp, and it won't hurt the knife. And so there's a bigger one and a smaller one, but they're both just big knives.
I remember you showing me pictures of that on your phone of Fire to Fire, and I was just, you know, drooling like, oh, that's so cool.
Just crazy and so much fun. Well, so he gets these knives, and he now he's taken them with him, and he's deployed, and he's taken them in his deployment. And so now we're going back to that connection with our ancestral warrior cultures, and being able to be the person who produces a tool, and hopefully he doesn't have to use them to defend himself, but maybe he will. And knowing and having the confidence that it will serve him well in that setting, no matter where he's at.
Oh yeah, I pity the fool who's going to be on the receiving end of either of those.
Oh, yeah. But that process of making the handle and incorporating that piece of history into the knife was just really, that was a lot of fun. So coming up, I have another Bowie knife I'm working on. It's a Farrier's Rasp Bowie, and I've recently gotten a hold of some old wrought iron wagon wheels.
Oh, wow.
And so we're going to incorporate some of this wrought iron into the handle and the guard. And so that's one of my upcoming projects that I'm excited about. And every once in a while, I'll have somebody who just wants a good everyday knife that they can carry around and use. And a couple of years ago, I made a knife. It was three or 4 years ago. I made a knife for a guy that is a trapper, a professional trapper. And just this last year, he sent me a picture of the knife, and he says I never have to sharpen it. It holds an edge like crazy, and I I use it almost every day. And so it's, I don't know, it's very, very rewarding to know that these tools and this art that I'm making is being used and being appreciated. So yeah, that was probably a really long way to answer that question, but it's something.
That was exactly what I was hoping to hear, though, is hear some of that good information that, the real things that have been awesome for you to work on. So you're obviously taking commissions then for this type of work, and you make baskets too, which we didn't have a ton of time to go into today, but
I make baskets, as I'd mentioned to you over the break, that I don't sell a lot of baskets. I love making them, and my wife has a rule that I can't have more baskets than people in the same room. So if I make a new basket and we've got too many of them, I eventually have to sell some. So they come up for sale every once in a while. I don't do a lot of commissions for baskets because all of the basket material I use is hand harvested, and so I go through. There's a whole process there. You don't just go out and cut down willows and make a basket. It can take several weeks just for one basket. So yeah, we don't sell a lot of those, but we do occasionally. So when they come up for sale, you got to snatch them up really quickly.
That sounds great. Yeah, you should probably just start taking a waiting list.
My knife waiting list right now is about 3 months. So
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it.
Poor guy who's waiting on these bows, I think it's been over a year. But he's patient because he knows that the end result is going to be worth the wait. So
man, especially with a new project like that, though, there's so much, what I would refer to as research and development that needs to go into it, so that, like you said, you as the craftsman are confident with the product that you're providing somebody with, that they're paying good money for, to be able to get as a really good historical piece and functional piece, and everything else. So, well, Dan, how can people get in touch with you for traditions education? What ages of kids do you teach? Things like that. And where are you located?
So I'm located in the Treasure Valley area of Idaho, so around the Boise area. And if people want to get in touch with us, social media has been a real blessing. It's one of the best ways to reach out to us, and at least find out what we're up to. If you want to follow along and you don't live in our area, but you're curious and you want to kind of see what we're up to. So if you go to Facebook and look up Traditions Education, you can find us there, and on Instagram. So we post on both of those places. So that's a good place to kind of find us. We have some camps, summer camps coming up where we're teaching things. And then during the school year, we're not a really big school. We only have about 50 students. And but we're very focused in what we do. So if people are interested in getting involved during the school year, they can reach out to us and we can talk more about that. And then as far as the bladesmithing or bow making, or some of the survival instruction that I do, most of that we do through the 4D Blades business. So that's on Facebook and Instagram at the number 4, the letter D, and the word blades, BLADES. Those are both very good ways to reach out to me. If you are interested in getting a copy of my book that I am working on, as long as you're patient, because like everything I do, it's important to me that this is really high quality and it will serve people really well. You can follow along with what I have going on there. I have been posting information, excerpts from the book in the Traditions Education Facebook and Instagram pages. So there's a ton of really good plant information that's coming out through that as well. So that's another place that you can kind of check us out and look things up. And if you haven't noticed, I love talking about this stuff. And so you're always welcome to reach out to me. Connections with people is really important. One of the common phrases we hear about primitive skills and ancestral skills gatherings is you come for the skills, but you stay for the community.
Yeah.
We're trying to build a community of like-minded people who believe in and support these kinds of things. And so if you want to be part of that community, we're very welcoming, and we love and support the people around us. So we invite you to be part of that and to join us in that community.
Man, that is so cool. Do you have, if I remember right, recently I saw that you actually have a primitive weapons class for kids, like an entire, how long is that? Like, is it a workshop? Is it a week-long thing? Is it a camp? What does that look like?
Yeah, we're doing a week-long camp. It's going to be full days from 8:30 to 3 o'clock from Monday to Friday. We're starting August 2nd and going through the 6th. And when I was a kid, I would have died and gone to heaven if I had had access to a camp like
Me
this.
too. Me too.
There's a lot going on in this camp. Of course, we're learning the historical part of the weapons. We're learning how to make them and how to use them, but we're also learning some of the physics principles that goes into making and using good tools, and some of the connection with effective learning processes. So this is a great opportunity for kids. It's funny to me. A mistake people often make is they'll think that primitive weapons or whatever kind of thing can be scary. The reality is they're not. As humans, we're strangely wired to want to throw things, and our physiology matches being able to throw things.
Yeah.
And so we have kids signing up right now. I think the youngest is a little gal who's 7 years old, and the oldest is 17. And so we have that whole age range, and we scale the activities and the learning experiences to their developmental level. So they're able to have a good time and enjoy themselves regardless of what age they are, and coming into these camps. So, and we'll be holding that here in the Treasure Valley area.
Excellent. And for those of you, Treasure Valley, greater Boise kind of area in Idaho.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. I would have, like you said, died and gone to heaven if I would have had that opportunity as a kid, because you guys are making atlatls, you're making bows, you're making rabbit sticks, you're making, what else did you mention?
We'll be doing some primitive trapping. We'll show them how to make nets, how to make trap triggers and that sort of thing. Yeah, it's actually, we'll be adding in some things about making decoys and all of the elements that our ancestors used to feed themselves and protect themselves. We're going to have a lot of fun, and the kids aren't going to know that they're getting something that every one of us adults wish we had had, but it'll be a memory that will be one of those formative memories in their life.
Exactly, completely foundational.
So that's the one that we've recently announced. We are also holding the week after a mountain man survival camp where we're exploring different survival skills, fire building, shelter building, that kind of thing. And in addition to that, we are kind of looking at it through the lens of the fur trade and the interaction of the mountain men that were coming through the Idaho area. And then the final camp that we're doing for this year is a bladesmithing camp. And here's the cool thing about this bladesmithing camp. It's a week-long camp, and this is just for kids. So we'll be working with kids from 10 to 17 and teaching them this process of how to forge a knife. And man, if I had had this when I was just getting into it, I'd be a lot further than I am now. But yeah, we'll be doing the whole process of forging the knife. We'll be exploring the geometry and physics of good knife design, some of the art and principles of design that go into developing those. And then, of course, the history and where we come from and why we design knives the way that we do, and looking at different cultures and how they might have done things a little bit differently. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So we have those big 3 camps that we're doing this year. We've wrapped up our ancestral skills gatherings until rabbit stick, which is coming up in September, which, by the way, I will be at this year.
Brilliant.
And teaching. We don't know what I'm teaching yet, but when they call you up and say, hey, we really want you to come teach, then you figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's really cool. He's more than an employee to us. I almost use the term employee, but he does like all of our fulfillment and shipping. His name is Jared. we came back from Fire to Fire, and he's like, damn, I really wanted to go. And it's like, well, you should go to Rabbit Stick. That one's been around the longest, and it's probably the biggest one these days as well. You know, it's been around for something like 35 years or something. So
Yeah, I think this is year 33. We missed a year last year, but yeah, it's been around for a long time.
yeah,
And the largest and longest running ancestral skills gathering in the world.
it's so
So
cool.
it's a big deal.
It is a way big deal. I strongly encourage everybody who's listening, if you're interested in primitive living, primitive skill sets, you know, ancestral living, all of these different types of things, you know, fire making, you know, if you've ever watched Alone or any of these survival shows, you really ought to prioritize going to one of these events. And it's exactly what Dan said. My experience with Fire to Fire was exactly epitomized by what you said earlier, which was you come for the skills and you stay for the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, cool, Dan. Is there anything else that that you'd like to get across to anybody? Like the school year, the upcoming school year is starting. You still have room for registrations?
We do have a couple of spots open, but it's the kind of thing that you have to jump on right away. So, like I say, we only have 50 students.
Yeah.
As a result, once you get in, you want to hang on to it as long as you
Yeah.
can. So yeah, we do have a couple of spots open if you're living in this area. But it's not the kind of thing that I would hold off on. We will have a waiting list. We have more than 90 people who've expressed interest in this year, so I can't promise that you'd be able to get in. However, because of the extra classes and programs that we offer, you'll be able to get into part of it, even if you can't get into the regular school year.
Cool.
And if I'm going to add something to that, one of the reasons we're able to do what we're doing is because of a phenomenal community that surrounds us. We have a lot of supportive families, but in addition to that, there's a number of really great outdoor school type programs in this area, this greater Boise area, Treasure Valley area. And I'm good friends with many of the people who are running these programs, and they're working hard and doing really good things. So if you can't get in with our program, but you would like to reach out to us, we can help you connect with some of the other people that are out there and working really hard to do good things.
Super cool. Well, we're just about out of time. Again, you can be in touch with Dan, especially through Facebook and Instagram at Traditions Education. That's on FB, that's on IG. You can also find them at 4D Blades. That's the number 4, letter D, and then the word blades. And that's probably going to be the best ways to interact with him, get in touch with him, and learn about the different things that are going on. You'll see, just like I have recently, tons of cool content, pictures, videos. My favorite thing is where you stoically come on with new knives that you've made and just cut paper like it's butter. Man,
yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's just so cool. And really, we just barely even scratch the surface of things that we can talk about. One of these times, I'd like to have you back on. We'll talk about maybe setting up a forge. Of course, when you release your book, we want to have you back on and talk about that. So, man, this is hopefully the first of many conversations that we can have. So if you guys like this episode, please be sure to, if you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification, leave some comments. Let us know about what you might want to learn more about or other questions that we could ask Dan here in the future. And if you really like this content and the content that we're putting out, the best way that you can help support us is just simply get the word out. Of course, visit our website. Everything at our apothecary always helps to support this mission. It takes a lot of time and effort for my team and I to be able to book people and to schedule people in to be able to make this content free. So any support that you can offer us is really, really appreciated, but especially just getting the word and the message out about this podcast. Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much once again for coming on Alchemi-Culture. It's been a pleasure talking with you as always, brother.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Alchemi-Culture. Until next time, have a great one.